Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Catholic Theological Union. I'm Sister Barbara Reed, President of CTU, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this year's Holocaust Remembrance Lecture Series. As we remember tonight the horrors of the Holocaust, we also hold in our hearts the fresh pain of those who have been murdered this year in our country by gun violence, and those who are suffering and dying in the conflicts between Russia and Ukraine and in the Sudan. We remember and we continue to pray for a cessation of violence and for a just and lasting peace to envelop our world. For those of you who may be new to CTU, we were founded in 1968 in the wake of the Second Vatican Council, and we have been very committed since our founding to interreligious dialogue, especially through our Catholic Jewish Studies and Catholic Muslim Studies programs. Under the leadership of Father John Polakowski and Rabbi Chaim Perlmutter of blessed memory, two of our founding faculty members, the Catholic Jewish Studies program became a hallmark of CTU, and we treasure the deep and lasting friendships that have been formed between CTU and our Jewish partners in the last 5 decades. In 2001, CTU established a chair in Jewish studies made possible by a most generous gift of Lester and Renee Crown and Patrick and Shirley Ryan, which has been held since 2014 by Dr. Malka Zeiger-Simkovich, along with her directorship of the Catholic Jewish Studies program at CTU. In May of 2018, Dr. Simkovich initiated the Holocaust Remembrance at CTU, which has included in the past components such as lectures on the background of the Holocaust, in-person visits to the Illinois Holocaust Museum, talks given by Holocaust survivors. And so we're very grateful that you are joining us this year for this series. This is the first part tonight. We hope you will join us also next week for the second lecture. I invite you also to visit our website, ctu.edu, for more information about our programming. Whether a new or a longtime friend, we hope you will join us often. And now, Dr. Malka Simkovich will introduce tonight's lecturer.
Thank you, Sister Barbara. Good evening and welcome. My name is Dr. Malka Simkovich, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us at this evening's lecture, the first of 3 events that comprise our annual Holocaust education series that takes place every May. This evening's talk, But What Does This All Mean for Me? One Teacher's Journey to Culturally Relevant Holocaust Education in the 21st Century, will be delivered by Ms. Kimberly Jones. Ms. Jones is a high school English teacher at Chapel Hill High in the Chapel Hill Carrboro City Schools District, where she teaches honors and standard level English 10 courses with a focus on world literature. She teaches as co-coordinator for the AVID College Preparatory Program and serves on district equity and inclusion and instructional planning teams. Ms. Jones completed her bachelor's degree in English and her master's degree in education at Wake Forest University. Now here I need to stop and tell you that the original bio that Ms. Jones sent me a few weeks ago read as follows, but there's been a little update. The original bio that I was sent says, Ms. Jones is a national board certified teacher, the 2023 Burroughs Wellcome Fund North Central Region Teacher of the Year, and co-leader of the Olga Lengyel Institute for Holocaust Studies and Human Rights Regional Seminar in North Carolina. But I have an update, a brand new update to the bio. A few weeks ago, I emailed Kim to check in about this event, and I didn't hear back from her for a day or two, which is absolutely not a big deal. This happens all the time. But when she emailed me back, she said, I'm so sorry. It's been a little bit busy for me because I've been appointed the Burroughs Wellcome Fund State of North Carolina's Teacher of the Year. So now we have tonight with us, not the North Central Region Teacher of the Year, but North Carolina Teacher of the Year, which is pretty extraordinary. We have an educator with us tonight who is committed not only to doing outstanding work in Jewish Christian reconciliation, but is a world-class educator. And it's a huge honor and privilege to have Ms. Kimberly Jones with us tonight. Just a few logistical comments before we get started. We will be recording this evening's event. We are going to leave time at the end, hopefully, for robust conversation and interactive discussion. Please feel free over the course of the hour to put your comments and questions into the chat box. And we will also plan to take some questions directly from audience members if there's time, and you can use the hand raise feature to do so when we get there. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Ms. Kimberly Jones.
Good evening. Thank you so much, Malka. Thank you so much, Sister Barbara. Thank you to CTU and my Holocaust education home, TOLI, for making the connection and allowing me to be with you all tonight. I will lead with really important information I think you should know, and that is that I am a high school English teacher by trade and by practice. And tonight's lecture may be a little different than the typical sort of collegiate lecture. I'm going to run it like I run conversations in my classroom. And I hope to not only talk about how I teach Holocaust education in my courses, but also reveal a bit about myself and what brought me to this work and why I think it's so vital in the 21st century. So I start every class that I teach. Every day my kids can come into my classroom and look up on the board and see the agenda and see where we're headed. And so I wanted to give my audience tonight the same thing. There are four kind of topics that I hope to cover with you all tonight. Number one, I want to tell you a little bit about who I am and how who I am impacts what and how I teach. The bulk of our conversation is going to focus on how I infuse culturally responsive teaching practices into the best practices for Holocaust education as defined by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And lastly, I want to talk a bit about what this form of Holocaust education means for and to me, what it means for my students, and hopefully what it may mean for you. So let's dive in. I've spent the majority of my personal, academic, and professional life seeking to meaningfully present and incorporate a diverse and underrepresented perspective into academic and professional settings. As a Black woman educator, I feel a personal, intellectual, and moral call to do so, as I believe diverse voices and perspectives are a critical and necessary asset to any endeavor. I've spent the majority of my professional life pursuing opportunities to grow my knowledge and appreciation of other cultures in the same way that I hope other people are actively seeking greater knowledge of my culture. I believe firmly that this intentional immersion in diverse cultures, experiences, and beliefs is the best way to build connection and understanding. I believe it should be the responsibility of any thoughtful global citizen, but especially educators, teachers. We have the power daily to model cultural inclusiveness and respect with and for and to our students. I spent a great deal of my career developing myself as a culturally conscious, respectful, and equity-minded teacher and advocate through tons of professional development, personal study, and the incorporation of those best practices into my classroom pedagogy. Not only my pedagogy, but the routines and the general vibe of my classroom. When my kids come into my room, they can examine everything from the text and media we study to the diverse examples I use in my teaching, to the art on the walls of my classroom, even the background music I play while they're doing independent work, to see that their teacher is appreciative, celebratory, and embracing of all cultures. I also deliberately seek to include underrepresented voices. I'm constantly reading new text in search of works that will better reflect the width and breadth of human experience, especially for the underrepresented cultures in my classroom. So how does who I am influence my teaching? I am, above all, a lover of people and their stories. I am at root and at foundation, a Black woman from a small, Southern, rural, predominantly white town. And that influences how I've experienced education, and it drives who I am as a teacher today. Because of those identities, I understand how it feels to see little to none of your culture reflected in your school curriculum. Aside from the annual reading of Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech every Black History Month, I had little exposure to Black authors or thought leaders in my formal education. In fact, I was a sophomore in college before I had my first Black educator. These identities lead me to understand the impact of having the only representation of your culture or identity in your curriculum be grounded in trauma and oppression. I distinctly remember that awkward feeling of the grade school field trips to Confederate battlegrounds and plantations, the isolation of having all the eyes in your predominantly white honors history course turn to you when your teacher asks for the Black perspective on post-war Civil War Reconstruction, Jim Crow, or affirmative action legislation. These identity-driven experiences deeply influence my awareness, perspective, and pedagogical choices as a classroom teacher every day. Above all, they lead me to understand that every student who enters into a classroom must first feel seen, affirmed, respected, long before we can begin to ask them to extend understanding, concern, or empathy to other people. It's for this reason that my Holocaust unit only comes at a point in the school year when a community of trust has first been established. Once all of my students feel known and valued, at that point, we're able to dig into critical topics like the Holocaust and other forms of systemic discrimination and hatred. I understand and make it clear to my students before any texts are read or lectures are given that pain and systemic oppression, they exist on a tragic spectrum across time, across human existence, not on some hierarchical ladder of who had it worse or some twisted version of oppression Olympics. In studying the Holocaust, we will naturally be drawn to discussing other instances of systemic violence, but any analogies will be grounded in the systematic commonalities that all forms of bigotry and hatred share. For this reason, my students learn about the pyramid of hate and how each one of its stages can be clearly identified in the Holocaust. During those conversations, my students are invited to identify other historical and cultural examples of these processes from their own lives, from their own culture, from their nation's history. I believe that this invites greater personal relevance and understanding while acknowledging that the reality of systemic violence did not begin, nor sadly did it end with the Holocaust. I understand and make clear to my students that none of us are free until all of us are free. Despite ever-increasing polarization, our fates remain intrinsically linked as a global society. And the purpose of studying and understanding the patterns and methodologies of hatred and bigotry across time is not meant to mire anyone in guilt or shame for the discriminatory actions of their ancestors, but instead, it's meant to make us all more vigilant to their reoccurrence in contemporary society and to be better prepared to combat them when they do. As I mentioned, my Holocaust education is grounded in the best practices as outlined by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And I want to use those same guidelines in guiding you through tonight's lecture. So, one of the first guidelines that the USHMM teaches us is to strive for precision of language. In the outline for tonight's talk, I talk about culturally relevant teaching in relationship to the Holocaust. And I want to make it clear exactly what I mean. I know right now any term that has the acronym CRT can be a red flag for some people, and I want to clarify exactly what I mean by these terms. When I say culturally responsive teaching, I simply mean using the students in my room, their customs, their characteristics, their experiences, their ideas and perspectives as a tool to drive how I teach. When I talk about culturally relevant pedagogy, I simply mean a pedagogical model that's going to focus on multiple aspects of student achievement and support students to uphold their cultural identities. Culturally relevant pedagogy also calls for students to develop critical skills that lead them to challenge social inequalities when they observe them. There are two leading scholars that I would love to share with you if you're interested in these practices. One is Dr. Zaretta Hammond, author of one of the core texts on culturally relevant teaching. And the other is Dr. Gloria Ladson Billings, who is a key pedagogue around culturally relevant teaching. So, the first thing I have to do for my students is define the Holocaust. And I use the definition as given by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. The Jewish experience is at the center of our defining, understanding, and studying of the Holocaust. Nazis identified Jewish people as their priority enemy. In addition to this core definition, I'm also intentional in incorporating the other groups the Nazis target as threats to the health, unity, and security of the German people. The Roma, disabled, Afro-Germans, some of the Slavic peoples were also targeted for destruction or decimation for perceived racial and biological inferiority. Millions more, including homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, Soviet prisoners of war, socialists, communists, political dissidents, also suffered grievous oppression and death on behavioral, political, and ideological grounds. Once my students have a working definition for the Holocaust, I begin to contextualize the history. I set the context by beginning with a historical context lecture. But before I dive into the timelines, the maps, or even give my students the lecture, I make it a very, very pointed point to let them know who I am and what I am. I'm a very informed English teacher with a passion for teaching the Holocaust. What I am not is a World War II scholar. I present my students with a concise and accessible timeline of the historical events that led to Hitler's rise to power. Things like the Nazification of Germany, with a focus on anti-Semitic propaganda, the Nuremberg race laws, organized violence, ghettoization, the ultimate invasion of Poland in the beginning of World War II, the Wannsee Conference and the enacting of the final solution, and the realities of life and death in the numerous types of camps constructed by the Nazi regime. I let my students know, and I will share with you, that the geopolitical complexities of World War II will not be our focus. Our focus will be on the experience and stories of those who suffered, were persecuted, and killed during this period. If a student asks a question, and I will make the same point to you, if a student asks a question I don't know the answer to, I let them know. I don't presently know that information, but here is a vetted source. You can search for that information, or in really pressing cases, I have been known to pause my lecture and call a history colleague on the phone during class and talk. I believe that this intentional transparency is critical for the most honest and effective teaching of any subject. I'm a teacher, yes, but that doesn't make me a sage on a stage or the source of all knowledge in my classroom, especially for a topic as vast and as complex as the Holocaust. If I want my students to be open to learning about the Holocaust or any other issue, idea, or event, I think it's imperative that they understand that learning is a continual process. We'll never have all the answers, but what we do have are the tools and capacity to continually grow our knowledge and understanding of the people and the world around us. As a woman of color, teaching outside of my own culture and background, I find intellectual and emotional vulnerability to be paramount. I constantly remind myself that I am stewarding my students through someone else's story. And I try to hold myself to the level of accountability to truth and complexity that I pray others feel when telling the story of Black Americans. As an English teacher, my context also includes literary pieces that reflect the political and social landscape of the time. I believe these texts help students to build contemporary and personal connections to the historical context, both political and social. For example, very early in my Holocaust unit, my students read a very short story called The Ball. In this short story, there are two very young boys, one German, one Jewish, who are playing with a ball. The German boy throws the ball while the Jewish boy is distracted, and it smashes the window of a local shop. Long story short, despite the truth, despite the willingness of the German boy to come forward and the total innocence of the Jewish child's father shows up, claims responsibility, and pays for the window. As my students are reading this piece, I ask them to think about a time in their own lives when the truth just didn't matter. What does it mean for society at large when the truth no longer matters? Once I get into the historical context, questions immediately arise. My students often ask questions like, well, Ms. Jones, why didn't the US just intervene earlier? Why didn't non-Jewish citizens just revolt? Why didn't the Jewish citizens just leave? Why didn't more Nazi soldiers just refuse to obey Hitler? I began to address these questions by reminding my students that history, like their lives today, is nuanced. I give them as many facts as possible, but I allow them to experience productive struggle with the many factors that influenced people's decision-making or totally removed the ability to decide their own paths. For example, when students are talking about immigration, why didn't people leave? Why didn't people help them leave in larger numbers? I give them excerpts from the book Salvaged Pages, and I have them read firsthand accounts of immigration attempts. To further help my students understand the complexities of such situations, I give them the immigration requirements for Jewish citizens to leave Germany in the 1930s, and the same immigration requirements required to enter the the US from Germany in the same period. This is honestly one of the most impactful lessons in my classroom because many of my students see firsthand that just leaving or just doing anything is not as simple as the distance and safety of their 21st century lives might imply. I try to make the complexities of this situation even more relevant to my classroom by having my students examine the current requirements for immigration into the United States. I'm incredibly fortunate to have a diverse student population that includes students who have immigrated to the US or been granted asylum from deadly violence in their home countries. Because of the relationship and community that I spend building from day one, many of my students are willing and able to discuss the difficulties and challenges of their family's own journey to the US. Accuracy of fact, together with a balanced perspective on the history, is most necessary. In teaching the Holocaust, we are implored to strive to provide a balance of perspectives that inform our study. From the reality of the matter, most of the primary documentation we have comes from the perspective of the perpetrators. Therefore, things like survivor testimonies, artifacts that humanize individuals become paramount. While oppression and death are a significant part of the story, it should never be the only perspective given. It's for this reason that I strive to provide my students with a multiplicity of texts and media that show and honor Jewish life before, during, and after the Holocaust. Dr. Deborah Lipstadt has a quotation that I share with my students, not only in our study of the Holocaust, but in our study of contemporary issues. Dr. Lipstadt says, there are facts, there are opinions, and then there's lies. And what deniers want to do is take the lies, dress them up as opinions, maybe edgy opinions, maybe sort of out of the box opinions. But then if they're opinions, they could be part of the conversation. And they begin to encroach on facts. It's important for me that even in giving a balance of opinion, that there is no academic space given to denial or reductionist points of view. While we readily acknowledge that such problematic viewpoints exist, they are in no way given equal evaluation. This is not an avoidance of a difficult topic on my part. It's an unequivocal refusal to substantiate such falsehoods by analyzing them as a claim with merit. To quote Dr. Lipstadt once more, many of us have grown up in a world of the academy and enlightened liberal thinking, where we're taught that everything is open to debate, but that's not the case. There are certain things that are true. There are indisputable facts, objective truths. Galileo taught it to us centuries ago, even after being forced to recant his theory that the earth moved around the sun. He came out and was reported to have said, and yet it still moves. This is a facet of Holocaust education that I believe has critical correlations to contemporary society. And for this reason, I use it to extend the conversation to modern instances of factual ambiguity and falsehood in social, political, and cultural life. My students are always ready and able to provide current examples of such alternative facts. And we discuss the impact of their problematic nature and the cultural fallout that they can create. Once my students have a working knowledge of the historical landscape, it becomes imperative to translate the statistics into people. 6 million is a vast and horrifying number. And it can be troubling and difficult for even the most learned of us to wrap our minds around. So for my teenage learners, I focus on 3 survivor stories. These 3 stories make up the core text my students study in our Holocaust unit, while each one is supplemented with additional primary source documents and excerpts from other memoirs of survivors from similar locations, age groups, occupations. These 3 stories are the foundation of my teaching, and each one resonates with my very diverse student populations for different reasons. In Elie's story, my students are moved by his evocative and illuminating prose. They stand beside him and share his horror as he witnesses events that consume his faith forever. They share his frustration with God and man and commiserate over his loss when his beloved father is taken to the crematory in the dead of night, while Elie unknowingly sleeps in his bunk above him. In Kitty Hart's no-nonsense recounting of her experience in Auschwitz, my students gain a more granular perspective of the horrors of life in the camps, especially the indignities faced by women. They shudder in revulsion as Kitty recounts her time working in the foul-smelling latrines, and are horrified when they learn of the extended starvation of prisoners kept in Block 25 until a sufficient number were present to justify the use of the gas chamber. They marvel at the attempts of Kitty's mother to nurse the infirmed back to health with little more than force of will and a hand to hold. In Vladek's account, my students observed the ostracism and dehumanization brought about by the Nuremberg laws as they watched Mr. Spielman go from a respected classical pianist to a prisoner in his own city. They mourned with him as he makes his gut-wrenching walk through his former neighborhood after the liquidation of the ghettos. They're both invigorated and heartbroken to see the valiant Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and its ultimate defeat by the Nazis. Collectively, these texts provide varied perspectives on life and death in the Holocaust, and their voices, as you will see, remain with my students long after our study ends. In addition to these stories, I also strive to make the story of the Holocaust even more relevant by highlighting the stories of survivors who settled in our local community of Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Stories like that of Barbara Lederman Rodville. She was a childhood friend of Anne and Margot Frank. Ms. Rodville survived in Amsterdam using false papers. Because of her features, she was able to get false documents that held up even as her family was forcibly liquidated from their home. Ms. Rodville goes on to work as a ballet dancer, and that job allows her to serve as a member of the Dutch resistance. Because she has her employment papers, she's allowed to be out much later after curfew, and she uses this freedom to help move people from various hiding places throughout Amsterdam. I teach my students about the story of Mrs. Simone Lipman. She was a member of a French Jewish Children's Relief Organization, the OSE. As a member of the OSE, she also was able to join the French resistance. She also survived under false papers in France. She helped to care for hundreds of Jewish children who were heartbreakingly given by their parents for a chance at life. She helped to smuggle Jewish children out of France. I teach them about the story of Ms. Renee Fink, who was born in Holland in 1937. She was hidden in plain sight by a Catholic family from 1942 to 1945. Her name was changed during hiding from Renate to Rita. She was hidden in the home, and because she was being hidden, she didn't go to school for those years. Ms. Fink survived the hunger winter of 1945, 1944 and 1945. Thankfully, she was reunited with her grandmother after the war, but unfortunately, she lost her parents to death and murder in a camp. Once my students have personal, historical, cultural knowledge surrounding the Holocaust, it can feel incredibly overwhelming to see how these events unfolded. But it's critical that my students understand that despite the writing on the wall, despite the perfect storm of geopolitical and economic factors, the Holocaust was in no way inevitable. At every stage, individuals, groups, nations made decisions to act or not to act. Persecution, genocide, systemic oppression are never an inevitability. It is not the birthright or natural destiny of any human being to be oppressed or killed for their identity. Nor is such persecution justified or redeemed by the lessons it teaches to the dominant culture. Systemic hatred and genocide must always be regarded as the horrors that they are. Individuals make decisions to act or not to act. This idea can honestly be empowering or overwhelming to students and people in general. I make room for that discomfort, but I never equivocate. In my classroom, we expand on this idea in our closing Socratic seminar. I ask my students to move from text to self to global application by asking them, do you truly believe that taking personal action against social justice is a realistic expectation? Why or why not? Should it be? Why or why not? What do you think prevents people from taking action when they observe injustice? And most importantly, and quite honestly, this is the hardest question my students have to ponder. How do you, the individual, determine when to take personal action against social injustice? I think it's important that, in the words of Elie Wiesel, we always remember there's divine beauty in learning. To learn means to accept the postulate that life did not begin at my birth. Others have been here before me, and I walk in their footsteps. The books I have read were composed by generations of fathers and sons, mothers and daughters, teachers and disciples. I'm the sum total of their experiences, their quests, and so are you. I'd like to begin to move into the closing of my presentation by sharing with you the words of my students. As a portion of their final assessment, my students are asked to reflect in writing on their personal learning during our study of the Holocaust. My students get 2 prompts. The first option is to write a well-constructed reflection paragraph in which you discuss the most important things you personally learned during our study of the Holocaust and how that knowledge will influence your future behavior. Or they can write a well-constructed reflection paragraph in which they discuss why and how Holocaust education is important for students in the 21st century. How is this historical event relevant to modern society and events? What you see on your screen and what will follow is a small sample of the responses I received this year and identifying information about the students who crafted it. The first excerpt I share with you comes from Jay, a 16-year-old white male student who wrote, "I come from a half-Jewish family. My dad is Jewish and religious enough that we celebrate major holidays. Well, I've learned a lot about being Jewish from him and the annually enforced Holocaust documentary he forces me and my sister to watch. Over the last 2 months, I've learned more than I ever thought I would about the Holocaust. It is so important that it's taught so that everybody knows the horror that came from it. Another reason I think it's important that it's taught is because of racism in general, not just particularly to Jews, but to any race or minority. I think it relates to modern events because all sorts of racism happens every day. The importance of the Holocaust being taught is to prevent mass racism in the future." From C, a 16-year-old Asian female student. "Before our study of the Holocaust, I was only watching videos on YouTube as my form of education for those topics. Now, after immersing ourselves deep within beautifully constructed literature, I'm able to engage in conversations and educate my friends and family who have had only the education I previously had, videos and articles online. It was only a few days ago when I started a conversation about the movie The Pianist. This movie was part of our curriculum, and the spark of pure feeling and emotion connected us to the Holocaust while revealing and telling the story of Vladek. The events of the Holocaust were tragic events that ultimately altered the mindset of the world around us. While we learn and recall the inhuman events of the past, it is important to know the strength of these beautiful men and women and children alike. Although these lessons may be coming to an end, I will never stop telling the stories of the Holocaust." This is from A, a 16-year-old biracial female student. "The most important things that I personally learned during our study of the Holocaust were the different ways that the Jewish people resisted the Nazis. I learned how parents in the ghettos would continue to educate their children despite it being illegal. I learned how people in the ghettos would still practice their religion despite that being the very thing they were being persecuted for. I learned from The Pianist how people in the ghettos would find ways to smuggle weapons in and rebel against the Nazis holding them captive. I learned from One Day in Auschwitz how Kitty's mother would beg her parents to stay alive. All these different acts of resistance were the Jews showing that they were strong and resilient. Too often, the facts of the Holocaust are presented in a way that make the Jewish people seem like lambs to the slaughter, when in actuality, it was anything but that. Having this knowledge that I've gained from the Holocaust unit will influence my future behavior by reminding me of the perseverance and will of the Jewish people." Finally, from O, a 16-year-old white non-binary student. "Until you started teaching me, I had never tried or wanted to see the Shoah as anything more than a picture of utmost suffering and hopelessness. While there was a massive amount of misery and fear, there was also determination to survive. I am truly in awe of all the survivors because I know I would not have been strong enough. This class is the first time I really reflected on that and understood the triumphs of those who survived. And I think that reflection and empathy is imperative for a true understanding of an event as massive as the Shoah. Anti-Semitism has insidiously slithered into countless cultures and societies. The Shoah was only a blatant example of quiet and normalized hate that impacts us to this day. Anti-Semitic propaganda was rampant during the Shoah, and we have not escaped it. Shoah education can really create empathy for lots of marginalized groups. The understanding of an event like the Shoah exposes us and leaves us vulnerable, a state that can allow us to create kindness and goodness in a world that needs it. Shoah education feels particularly important to me as a Jewish person. How many Jewish friends, schoolmates, teachers, would I have if not for the Shoah? I mourn the loss of a community that was so carefully planned. If we let this fade, Hitler has won. If we don't tell this story, we fail. We fail millions and millions of people. Thank you for teaching me. Thank you for allowing this learning to unfold. Thank you for taking the time to answer questions. Thank you for caring. Thank you for carrying the torch that shines a light onto Nazi Germany's cruelty and using that torch to light candles in all of us for all whom we have lost. I would like to end my portion of the presentation, my active portion, by thanking, first of all, my amazing students, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum for providing educators with these amazing guidelines, TOLI, who at present has regional summer programs open for applicants at toli.us, the North Carolina Council on the Holocaust, my in-state home for Holocaust education and development, and lastly, the North Carolina Center for the Advancement of Teaching that funds a great deal of my professional development. If you would like to contact me, I can be reached by email at kimjonesteaches@gmail.com. You can also follow me on Instagram at kimjonesteaches there.